All right. Can you introduce yourself for the tape?
My name is Aaron Kesselheim. I'm a primary care doctor, lawyer, and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, where I lead the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law.
And if you've ever been compared to somebody by your parents in not so great a light, Aaron is that guy. So, Aaron, thank you so much because you're our resident prescription drug expert here on AD. This is, I think, your third time on the show. We're super excited to have you because, of course, there's a lot of news relevant to prescription drugs, prescription drug prices. And I wanted to, jump in just because the latest news is about this executive order from the Trump administration on most favored nation clause. Can you break down how this is supposed to work and then what your general thoughts on it are?
Sure. So a couple days ago, the Trump administration issued an executive order basically requesting pharmaceutical companies lower their prices to what's called what they're calling the most favored nation, which is the lowest price that those drugs are available at in a number of similar sized European countries. And basically, the issue here is that in the United States, we pay for brand name drugs about two to three more than European and Canadian and Australian and other people in other high income settings pay for the very same drugs made by the very same manufacturers. And the reason is because after a drug is approved in the United States, we allow drug manufacturers to charge whatever they want. In those other countries, there's a second step in which they then evaluate the benefits of the drug and use that information to negotiate a price on behalf of the government. And so, what Trump is basically saying is that he wants drug manufacturers to sell the drugs in the United States at the lowest price that they're negotiating the price for in one of these other countries. So, that's the basic theory behind it. The problem is, of course, is that it's not clear that he has the authority to do that just by issuing an executive order. And in fact, he tried to do it in his first term. At the very, very end of his first term, he tried to do it with some rulemaking through CMS that would have set up a voluntary model for companies to do this, and that ended up getting shot down in the court. So I think that if Trump really did want to do this, he'd have to do it through legislation. So I don't really think that it is that putting it through an executive order is any kind of credible threat that this will actually happen. And in fact, the day that he issued the executive order, pharmaceutical stocks went up, like during his speech, with the recognition that, I think from the investors that this is all just a bunch of hot air.
Wow. So their response was basically like, "Oh, if this is it, then we're good."
That's right.
That's wild. So the EO, per what you're sharing here, doesn't really have teeth, and it's unclear whether or not an executive order could have teeth, which has been, I hate to say it, the theme of this administration. Do a lot of things by executive order, but without the kind of teeth that you really would want to see or have. Now, the question here is, let's break down. Let's just say they actually were able to pass this in legislation. What are your thoughts in terms of what that would do if this was legislation, if it did in fact have teeth? What do you think the consequence would look like? Because my sense is that it would then create an unintended consequence, which is now where pharma would now start to try and push a lot harder in these negotiations across the world rather than just simply sort of take it. How do you think about that?
Well, I think that you're exactly right, that there would be a lot of unintended collateral effects if the U.S. did base its prices entirely on what other countries were paying. So, for example, you could imagine a scenario where drug companies would not release the price that they're paying in other countries, so that the U.S. would not be able to know exactly what the price was, or they would release the drug in a slightly different formulation. Instead of a 25 milligram dose in Germany, it would be a 30 milligram dose, so that we would not be able to exactly replicate what the price would be in the United States. Or maybe they would delay the approval of the drug in those other countries to try to ensure that they extracted the maximum price they could from the United States before they started making the drug available in other places. So you can imagine a whole host of unintended consequences that would come from the United States doing this, which is why fundamentally, even though it is true that patients in the United States pay too much money for brand name prescription drugs, and we should pay fairer prices that are more based on the value of the drugs. The best way for us to do that would be for us to evaluate the benefits of each drug as they're approved ourselves, and negotiate ourselves with the manufacturers in the United States. Again, this is the same thing that all these other countries do, and there's no reason that a country that as large and as with as much resources as we have is not doing that sort of thing ourselves. In fact, this is what the Inflation Reduction Act that Joe Biden passed does, but it has a waiting period of 9 to 13 years for drugs and only applies to a very small number of top-selling drugs. And so I think what we should be doing is shortly after drugs are approved by the FDA, is undertaking this kind of a process then.
So there's a couple of things I want to pick apart there because I think it's really just important context here. Why do other countries so clearly do it this way where our country does not? Let's start there. Like, why is that? Isn't it just baseline obvious that in our country we don't negotiate as a matter of course for prescription drugs, which, by the way, our taxpayer dollars disproportionately pay for the research and development of?
Well, I mean, I think that there are certainly historical reasons why we don't do it. In 2006, when Medicare Part D was created, which is the Medicare that covers outpatient drugs, it was actually written into the law that Medicare was not allowed to negotiate the prices of these drugs. For drugs covered by Medicare Part B, when Medicare Part B was created in the 1960s, we didn't really have a problem of a lot of very expensive drugs that doctors would deliver in the hospitals, just because there just weren't as many drugs available then as there are now. So we just never really historically had this in the United States. And, in the United States, the pharmaceutical industry is an extremely strong lobbying group, and gives money to legislators on both sides of the aisle. And this has, caused a lot of inertia when it comes to trying to change the law. In other countries, they tend to have systems where the government will be involved in providing healthcare coverage much more broadly than our government is. And in those countries, it was something that they did kind of as a matter of course. Like, we're going to negotiate the prices of drugs in these countries. It was sort of set up in as part of their national legal structure in the way that it just was never created here.
Yeah. And, as so many issues do, it kind of goes back to campaign finance, right? The pharmaceutical industry is the single biggest lobbyist by sector, spending 4.2 to 4.4 billion over the last 20 years lobbying. And that lobbying, well, it buys you policy. And we see it in the context of the extremely permissive structure for prescription drug price setting. And so we end up paying substantially more than any other country in the world. And we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act an attempt to try and address that. Obviously you and I were both intimately involved in thinking through that and some of the early research that went into what ultimately became the policy. But jog our memory here, right? We do have prescription drug price negotiation, 10 drugs at a time that meet very particular criteria. Can you walk us through what some of those criteria are?
Sure. So in order for a drug to be negotiated under the Inflation Reduction Act, it has to be a top-selling drug, which means that it has to have greater than $200 million of revenue in Medicare per year. It has to have been on the market. I told you there's this waiting period where a drug has to have been on the market for at least 9 years if it's a small molecule chemical drug, or 13 years if it's a larger biologic drug. And then there are other exclusions, like, if there's a generic version or biosimilar version of the drug, it's excluded. If it's a drug that's approved only for a single rare disease, then it's excluded. And as you said, Medicare was given the authority to negotiate 10 drugs in the first year of the program. And this year, they have selected 15 drugs. Next year, they're going to select another 15 drugs. And then the year after that, I think it increases to 20 drugs per year. And so it's a small number of top selling drugs at the towards the end of their market exclusivity periods.
It's interesting. The pharmaceutical industry argues that if we were to wholesale start negotiating the prices of prescription drugs, that somehow this would be a damper on research and development for new medications in the pipeline. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I mean, I think that it is worth recognizing that pharmaceutical development is a costly process and a risky process, and we should make sure that there is a fair, that people can charge fair prices for the drugs that they invest money in. But I think it's also worth recognizing at the same time that we recognize those points. That a lot of the key innovation that goes into drug development is publicly funded through the NIH, so a lot of the earliest stage, riskiest type of research that on which a lot of these drugs are based occurs at academic medical centers or government labs. I think it's also worth recognizing that pharmaceutical companies large pharmaceutical companies spend only about 10 to 20% of their revenue on research, whereas more like 20 to 30% goes on marketing and administration and a salary, CEO salaries and those types of things. Another large percentage goes back to shareholders. And I think it's also worth recognizing that when we talk about a process for negotiating, where the negotiation occurs on the basis of the benefits that those drugs provide. So a very effective drug that meets an unmet medical need is going to extract a high price from a healthcare system that's as wealthy as ours. But what happens right now is that a lot of drugs that don't add a lot of benefits end up getting sold at very high prices, and we spend a lot of money on drugs that don't have a lot of benefits. So if we did have a system of negotiating prices, I think that it would actually improve innovation because it would it would give fair compensation to really meaningful innovation, and it would give less compensation to less meaningful innovation. And I think that would send a very strong signal to the drug companies about investing in the most important, most meaningful innovation.